The wedding was like a dream, a cascade of white silk and whispered vows, the kind of day that seems to stretch into eternity. But the night was nothing like I had envisioned. We had danced around the subject of intimacy with a ballet of excuses from him, each more elaborate than the last. But on our wedding night, the truth was laid bare, quite literally. I remember lying there, the silence of our shared room heavy as a funeral shroud. My new husband, my dear, my love, stood before me, his vulnerability as naked as his body. It was then I saw it, the source of all those excuses, the secret he had kept buried like a shameful relic. His micropenis, as they call it, stood there, not in defiance but in defeat, a pathetic little thing that whispered of all the lies we had danced around. I tried to understand, to be the compassionate wife. I held him, whispered reassurances in the dark, kissed his forehead with the tenderness of a mother soothing a child. But understanding is one thing, accepting is another. Days turned into weeks, and those weeks into months, where each night was a silent parade of avoidance, of turning away from each other, not out of disdain but from the sheer awkwardness of our situation. He tried, bless him, with gadgets and tricks one might find in a cheap sex shop, but it was like trying to ignite a fire with damp wood. The flames never caught. My body ached for something more, something wild and unrestrained, something that would fill the void his inadequacy had left gaping inside me. It was at a friend's dinner party, where the wine flowed like water in the Nile, that I met him. His name was irrelevant, but his presence was like a storm breaking through the calm. He was all that my husband wasn't. Bold, confident, his laughter a promise of liberation. We didn't speak of it, but we both knew. The air was thick with unspoken desires, the kind that would lead to betrayal. I remember the first time, the guilt wrestling with the ecstasy. It was in the back seat of his car, parked under the indifferent stars. His touch was like fire, burning through the layers of my restraint. I had been a good wife, but now, as his hands roamed over me, I was something else, something primal, alive with a hunger I could no longer deny. I returned home to my husband, his back to me as he slept, the weight of my betrayal heavy on my chest. But the taste of freedom, of passion, it was intoxicating. I knew then that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. Each night after that, I found myself craving more, the thrill of the secret, the danger of the discovery, becoming as essential to me as the air I breathed. The more I strayed, the more I felt alive. Each encounter was a rebellion against the silence of our marriage bed, a loud, defiant shout against the dull, throbbing ache of unfulfilled desires. My husband, oblivious or perhaps willfully ignorant, continued his life as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had shifted. The world was no longer in black and white, but painted in the vibrant colors of sin and salvation. My lover, whose name I still didn't bother to remember, became my escape, my secret world where I could be the woman I was meant to be, uninhibited, passionate, consumed by lust. We met in motels with names like the Golden Sunset or the Whispering Willow, places where the neon lights flickered like the guilt in my eyes. There, in those rooms with their stale air and stained sheets, I found a kind of truth, a truth wrapped in the arms of a man who wasn't my husband. But with each clandestine meeting, the weight of my deception grew heavier. I began to see my husband not as a man, but as a symbol of my own complicity in this charade. He was not just small in body but in spirit, or so I told myself to justify my actions. I watched him, sometimes with a kind of detached pity, as he made his coffee in the morning, unaware of the storm brewing in his own house. The lie became my reality. I learned to compartmentalize, to live two lives with a precision that would make any spy envious. At home, I was the dutiful wife, attending to the mundane details of our life together. But the moment I stepped out, I shed that skin, transforming into someone else, someone who laughed louder, loved harder, lived more. One evening, at one of these secret meetings, my lover looked at me with eyes that seemed to pierce through my facade. "You enjoy this, don't you?" he asked, not with malice, but with a kind of awe. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I pulled him closer, desperate to drown out his words with the rush of our bodies. But the thrill was beginning to wear thin, replaced by a gnawing sense of emptiness. Each encounter, once a thrill, now felt like another nail in the coffin of my soul. I began to question if this was all there was to my liberation, if this was the freedom I had sought. The sex was still explosive, but the aftermath left me hollow, like a firework that burns brightly only to fade into nothing. I started looking for signs in my husband, waiting for the moment he would confront me to end this charade. But he never did. His silence was his weapon, his ignorance his shield. And in that silence, I found myself sinking deeper into the abyss I had created. One night, after another passionate escape, I returned home, the scent of another man on my skin. My husband was awake, reading by the lamplight. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine, but he said nothing. The silence was deafening, and in that moment, I realized how far I had fallen. The thrill of infidelity had turned into a heavy chain, and I was its prisoner. The days that followed were like living in a fog, where every step felt uncertain, every breath heavy with the weight of my choices. My husband, always the silent observer, seemed to grow more distant, his presence in our home like a ghost haunting the same spaces I once thought were ours to share. I continued my escapades, not out of desire but out of routine, like an addict who knows the drug is killing them but can't stop reaching for it. Each meeting with my lover felt less like an escape and more like a sentence. His touch, once electric, now felt like static, the passion draining from our encounters as quickly as the color from a dying leaf. One evening, as I prepared for another night of deceit, I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked. The reflection wasn't of the woman who had married in hope, but of one who had lost herself in her own lies. I saw the lines of guilt etched into my face, the shadows of betrayal under my eyes. That night, I didn't go to him. Instead, I wandered the city alone, the streets echoing my internal turmoil. The city, with its endless lights and endless noise, felt like a mockery of my own life, bright but empty. I sat in a park, the cold seeping through my clothes, and for the first time in months, I cried. Not for the loss of my marriage, but for the loss of myself. Returning home, I found my husband still awake, the same book in his hand, his eyes not on the pages, but staring into the distance. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of all the unspoken words between us. He looked at me then, really looked, and in his eyes I saw not just hurt, but understanding. "I know," was all he said, and those two words carried the weight of our entire marriage. We talked, or rather, I confessed. Every detail, every lie, every moment of betrayal spilled out of me like a dam breaking. He listened, his face inscrutable, his emotions hidden behind a mask of calm that I had never seen crack until now. When I finished, there was silence, a palpable silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Why?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. I had no answer, not one that could justify my actions. "I was lost," I said, which was the closest I could get to explaining the void I had tried to fill with another. He nodded, slowly, as if accepting this not as an excuse, but as a truth. "And now?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "Now." That word hung between us like a question mark. Now I had to face the wreckage of what I had done. Now I needed to find myself again, to rebuild or to leave, but to do it honestly. "I want to try," I said, not sure if I meant to mend what was broken between us, or to mend myself. But in that moment, it was all I could offer. We didn't speak of divorce or forgiveness that night. Instead, we sat in silence, a new kind of silence, one not of avoidance, but of contemplation. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of something like hope, or perhaps it was just the dawn of a new understanding. As I lay in bed, not touching him but near, I realized that my journey into infidelity had led me back to one undeniable truth. You cannot escape yourself. The thrill, the passion, the betrayal. It was all just a detour in the journey back to my own soul.